I find this an absolutely bizarre time in the fiscal history of Australian government to be talking about rate capping. Rate capping is not something that you can put a tight box around. Rates are a tax, and rates are part of the way we fund the public sector in Australia and in our individual states. So any approach which somehow takes rates out of that broader taxation and public sector equation and in a sense demonises them as a bad way of raising revenue and one that needs to be scrutinised ever so much more than income tax and land tax and GST and so on, especially at a time when we're confronted with perhaps 40 years of federal budget deficits and so on, seems to me to be an odd starting point. And I think one of the things, I've drafted a paper for VLGA which Sebastian and the board are going to be having a look at this afternoon, I think, and hopefully they'll then release more widely. But certainly that starting point of rates being a tax that is part of the broader public sector is absolutely critical in my view, and should colour the whole way that this discussion takes place over the coming months, particularly having regard to the very difficult budget environment facing governments at all levels in Australia in coming years. And of course in local government in particular, the fags freeze and don't let's kid ourselves, it's not going to go away. We can have campaigns and carry on as much as we like, but given the federal government's position, the chances of that freeze being anything less than its current anticipated duration, and that the ultimate outcome is going to be anything less than the 13 or 15% permanent cut in the base level of fags, which is what it will create, we're kidding ourselves. That's what local government is confronted with, and that is hundreds of millions of dollars a year taken out of the public sector in this state. Not just taken out of local government, but taken out of the public sector in this state. The other point I wanted to make at the outset, which I've covered the part of this, is that, as I say, rates are a tax. We have a review of taxation underway federally. The last review of taxation under Ken Henry was very clear. Rates and land tax are an efficient form of taxation which could in fact deliver much more revenue into our tax system than they currently do. And if we're not prepared to put up the GST, if we don't want to have to live with significant long-term increases in income tax and so on, then we may well, as a nation, be looking at taxes on land and property as a more substantial component of the tax system. The other critical point about rates being a tax is that in local government we raise money in two broad categories. We have general rates, which are a tax, quite simply. All the rest of the money that local government raises, whether it's through special rates, charges, fees and so on, is in fact cost recovery. And in our budgeting, one of the things that we need to be doing more than we currently do is making it very clear that what that distinction is. Why are we raising general rates? Where is that money going? And why are we raising all those other forms of special rates, service charges and so on, which are there to fund specific costs? And if you think of it in those terms, it becomes ridiculous to try to cap all those other things. Certainly councils need to be scrutinised by their communities as to whether they're doing those other things efficiently and therefore keeping those cost recovery charges down to a minimum. But that's a very different issue from capping a general rate, which is a tax. And which amongst other things, and this I think hasn't been mentioned by anybody, rates are actually a wealth tax. They're a tax on the value of the property we own. Now we may not like that, and it does create problems for local government, but that's the reality. And the other reality is that for those of us who are fortunate enough to own property, we've been seeing enormous increases in our wealth in recent years. So I'm not sure that the part of rates that's a tax the real issue there is, you know, the so-called, you know, day-to-day affordability, because what's happening is that people's wealth is increasing. And it's very similar in that regard to the debate currently about superannuation and how we go about taxing superannuation. Because when we're starting to think about taxing wealth, and particularly looking at the sort of high-end, you know, property owners, people with a lot of property wealth, you know, is the real consideration there whether they're getting value for money for some services, or is the real consideration whether they're paying their way as a wealthy property owner? I'll just leave that thought hanging. What are we up to? New South Wales history. Okay, New South Wales, we've been stuffing around with this for 35 plus years. The first 30 odd years was an absolute bloody disaster. We had rate capping, you know, on a fairly arbitrary basis by a minister, all sorts of bizarre results. Very serious adverse consequences, which I know you've heard about. The one that's always headlined is the enormous infrastructure backlogs that New South Wales councils have accumulated. But the far more serious adverse consequence of those years was that, and I know Ron made the point that he didn't want this to happen, but what did happen was that councils basically said, well, bugger this. If the minister wants to cap rates, we'll let the minister take the responsibility for putting rates up. And so there was, in fact, an abrogation of responsible financial management across much of New South Wales local government. That is a terrible outcome, And in thinking about this in Victoria, you've got to avoid that outcome. And that colours what I'm going to say later on about the way you might want to go about it. The other very interesting thing from all the years of history of rate pegging in New South Wales is that, of course, we've had councils putting in applications, first to the Minister and more recently to the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, which is our ESC. And what all those years of experience has shown absolutely conclusively is two things. One that Michaela's mentioned, which is that people would rather pay more than see their services decline. That's absolutely crystal clear in New South Wales. The other thing that's crystal clear is that we should not get hung up on headline percentages. Rates, again, as Michaela mentioned, are often in dollar terms relatively low. I mean, compared to what we fork out for internet and telephone charges, or what we fork out for, you know, health insurance would be the absolute classic. For a lot of people, rates are a relatively low bill in absolute and relative terms. The New South Wales experience, and IPART has put out material on this in recent times, and we certainly found this in our review, is that anything less than about $2 a week in terms of a rate increase doesn't register all that much. You get very little adverse community reaction in that $1.50 up to $2 range. And in New South Wales, $2 a week is actually 10% of the average residential rate. So let's not get too hung up about percentages, particularly when we're measuring affordability. Absolute amounts of money count. Now, the big message, and this is going to be where I'm going to leave for the rest of my comments. The big message from New South Wales is that we have seen a major improvement in the way rate pegging has worked over recent years. And that improvement has come about for two reasons. One, because after an initial period when it got very bureaucratic, IPART realised, particularly under the new chairman, Peter Boxall, that there was no value in running a highly complex system. And, you know, Ron's made this point very clearly. There's just no value in that at all. So IPART has been very keen to pare back the complexity of the system. And in particular, it's been very keen to pare back the complexity of the application process and the number of applications it receives. And there's two main ways it's done that. One is, and they're interrelated. One is that rate pegging in New South Wales is now an adjunct of our integrated planning and reporting framework. IPART are not really treating it as a standalone system anymore. It's an integrated component of integrated planning and reporting, and I'll come to your equivalent of that in a moment. And the other thing is that virtually all approvals for above PEG increases in New South Wales in recent years are multi-year approvals. And there's a very good reason for that, which is because councils are required to plan multi-year, so it makes no sense whatsoever to be putting in annual applications, and IPART has made it clear it doesn't want to deal with annual applications. The other thing that flows from that, which hopefully is, oh, what have I done? There we go. So, what have we got now in New South Wales? We have a rate pegging framework which is integrated with integrated planning and reporting, lots of integrateds there. And I was at a conference about a month ago of our revenue professionals group in New South Wales, and we had two very senior IPART people speaking. And the point they made was this. The point they made was the integrated planning and reporting framework requires councils to go through that process of a long-term community strategic plan, a 4-year delivery program, which is basically your council plan, a resourcing strategy, which is your strategic resource plan, and an operational plan, which includes the budget process. The message they gave to councils was, do that first, and then worry about whether or not you've got to deal with the rate peg. So do the planning properly first, talk to your community, get an agreed direction, then worry about whether you need to put in an application. The point being this, that finding an agreed index or peg or cap is a holy grail. You will never, ever, ever get broad agreement on what is an appropriate annual percentage. Now, IPART puts out an annual percentage, but they made it very clear at this conference that they didn't want councils to worry about that. They wanted councils to do their job properly in terms of financial planning and budgeting and rate setting. And if they did their job properly, who cares whether the cap's 2%, 3% or 4%? The issue is the 5 or 6% justified? Not whether that exceeds a cap, but whether it is inherently justified in terms of the planning and budgeting process and consultation with the community. So justification should be what you're focusing on, not what the index will be. And in fact, as I'll say in a few minutes, I don't think you should have an index at all. Now, what have you got in Victoria currently? Well, what you've got in Victoria currently, and Ron alluded to this, is a much better framework than we started with in New South Wales. First of all, and most importantly, you've got a state constitution which talks about local government and which makes it clear that local government is accountable to local communities. I don't much like the word autonomy. It gets up people's noses in state and federal circles. But accountability to local communities is what you're all about. It's what your constitution says you should be about. So that's really the critical starting point. The other critical thing that your constitution tells you in New South Wales is that councils are responsible for ensuring good governance. Now, good governance includes good financial management, which includes not being stuffed around by silly arbitrary measures. But it does mean very much talking to the community about what's needed. Now then, moving around clockwise, in Victoria you've already got far more than we had 30 years ago in New South Wales, and even more than we've got now in New South Wales, in terms of a series of financial management and budget processes. So you've got the council plan, you've got the strategic resource plan, but importantly you've got two add-ons. You've got principles of sound financial management, which say some important things, including intergenerational equity, and you've got best value principles, which were brought in by a previous Labor government, and which, if adhered to rigorously, actually do everything you need to do to talk to your community about why rates are at a certain level. because they tell you to review the services, to look at efficiency, to look at funding, to look at community need, and so on and so forth. Where I think you might be a little bit light on in Victoria is in two respects. One is, I think the community engagement provisions around some of those things are a bit weak. Some councils I know do very, very good community engagement anyway. Others perhaps just tend to stick to the 28 days, receive a few submissions approach. I think probably our New South Wales experience says brush up a bit on that front. The other thing which the Auditor General here highlighted in a report a couple of years ago is that the actual process of rate setting and explaining rates and looking at what I was saying earlier about, well, you know, what's a general rate, what should be a service charge, justifying them differently and so on, that's not really spelled out in your processes at the moment. Moving around, the other thing you've got, which Ron mentioned, already you've got a very strong monitoring, reporting and audit framework in Victoria. In fact, you're monitored, reported and audited to death here. And the last thing you need really is someone else doing that. So you've got financial statements that are independently audited, you've got performance statements that are independently audited, you've got the new performance framework coming in, you're supposed to put in an annual report on your application of the best value principles, and then obviously you've got the overall Auditor General's report to the Parliament about where local government is heading. So you have a massive information about what councils do, which can be used to assess, and this is the key point, which can be used to assess whether councils are doing the right thing in the right way. You're already collecting all that information here. We weren't in New South Wales. And finally, you've already got rate capping. The Minister already has the power in the Local Government Act to cap rates. Now I would ask the question is, therefore, do you need any more legislation at all? That would be the critical question. Or can you actually use what you've got to achieve the government's objectives and to come up with something which adds just a few extra bells and whistles? And that really then takes me to the last couple of things I want to say. I think I've covered the areas of improvement. I won't go into more. So really what I wanted to conclude with is this. I think the process, I think the emphasis here, given everything you've got already, should be on tidying up and using the process you've had, not introducing a new process, and for God's sake, don't get hung up about an index. You could have a debate about CPI versus what MAV currently puts out versus something else, and Ron and his team could crunch a million numbers, and in 6 months' time you'd all come back into this room and you'd still all be disagreeing with each other. Because communities want different things. So whatever index you have is going to be artificial, and in my humble opinion, I'd be quite happy with CPI because it's patently silly. Start with something that's patently silly, and then you realise that you don't need to be hung up about the index. All you need to be hung up about is justifying what you're doing. Because if you produce a scientific index, you as councils will feel obliged to give it credence. Ron and his team will feel obliged to give it credence. And most importantly of all, the Minister will feel obliged to give it credence. So have something that's silly. That everybody can say, oh yeah, no, well of course we didn't mean that. And then you can actually start thinking about running a sensible process. So tweak what you've got, don't create something new. And my final, and I suppose radical departing thought is, I don't think you need a new application and exemption system at all. If I could go back, what I would be doing if I was the Minister here, given the government's commitments, I would be saying I would be tightening up a few of the guidelines, filling a few of those weak spots, and in that bottom left-hand corner where the arrow goes from monitoring and audit round to the Minister's reserved power to intervene, I would put ESC, review by ESC on that arrow, and I would be I would be having a situation where that massive monitoring and reporting data that you've already got can be used by ESC to have a look at what's going on in terms of rating, to do spot audits, to identify what it might regard as serial offenders, you know, who seem to be constantly putting the rates up by very large amounts, explore whether they're doing the right thing or not, and then advise the minister that, you know, things are not going very well in X, Y, Z, and why not use your current reserve power to impose a cap on that particular council for a particular period of time until they improve their processes and justify what they're doing. A whole lot simpler than developing a whole new system.